Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this episode, the first of our new walking and talking series, Janney takes us to the trails and vast expanses of Epping Forest with Luke Turner to discuss his book, Out of the Woods, which interweaves personal memoir with an examination of the forest and its own storied history. In their discussion, Turner speaks about the forest as a divider between city and countryside, the conservation efforts taking place to safeguard its various life forms, and its role as an inclusive space for all who venture in.
So I'm here with Luke Turner, author of Out of the Woods, which is a wonderful memoir taking Epping Forest as its central theme and outwardly exploring sexuality, trauma, childhood, environment, a whole host of things. And I'm with Luke now. We're on the fringes of Epping Forest, and I was wondering if you could tell us why you've chosen to enter the forest here as that wonderful tractor is going past.
Yeah, it's not really the sounds that you'd associate with nature necessarily here where we are on the corner of Bury Road and the road that goes past Chingford Station. I quite like that in that you get a real sense here of like Epping Forest being this part of London really. It's the edge of London, and we're by the last buildings in London, which is the Flabby Loss, Weight Loss and Chingford Chiropractic Clinic. You've got the Masonic Hall over there and a golf club. You know, it's not really sort of nature kind of your rural edges as you might expect. And we're right on the edge of Chingford Plain, which is a huge open area. Kind of one of the distinctive forest landscapes, big area of grassland. And actually in the 19th century, 100,000 people used to come bank holiday from Chingford Station. There'd be a train every 5 minutes. And the whole East Enders, just 100,000, would come out here and cause absolute havoc and have a massive party on Chingford Plain.
Wow.
It always descended into violence and chaos. So it's very different from what you might expect, you know, historically as a place where people would come for a nice walk and so on.
Great, well we're going to try and do that now.
We're going to go for find some quieter bit.
Let's make a start.
So we're walking into the forest now off the edge of the plain, past an oak tree which is commonly used as a dumping ground by people who think dog poo fairies will clean up after them. But it's not as bad.
Is it the oak tree specifically? Or?
This tree usually has a little pile of dog poos in bags.
I guess that's it. That's, you know, if that's the bad thing about that location. If you're right on the frontier.
Yeah.
I live by a railway. And that's also a dumping ground.
The dog turd threshold.
Yeah, all plastic bags and other things. But again, yeah, we feel like we've again sort of crossed another threshold from the kind of savannah.
Yeah, exactly. But that's
into something
interesting.
a lot cooler. I can feel it. It's noticeably cooler.
Well, it's interesting you say savannah because that's very much we'll go to an area in a bit, which is the woodland pasture landscape, which is quite open areas with dotted trees and clumps of trees. And that's the landscape that humans were in during the last ice age when we were pushed south. You know, this would have been under the edges of the ice sheets would have been hit around here. And that was the landscape that Epping Forest and a lot of Britain was. We have this vision of, you know, the primal wildwood that was tangled and you couldn't get in. And that's to an extent true, but they think it's possibly misleading to think of the whole country as being entirely covered in trees in that way. People kind of moved into it quite quickly and created these areas where they could graze cattle and have pigs rooting around, and it was an more open landscape than perhaps we previously thought.
The other thing I was interested to read was that actually we always see nature as something that is actually untouched by humans. Yeah. But actually Epping Forest is somewhere that has been made by humans.
Exactly.
And actually conserved by humans.
Yeah, we'll come to a bit later on where you get a real sense of that. Actually, we'll get that in a second, to be honest. So we're in an area now which is a bit of a glade, a bit of a clearing. On to the right of us there's an oak tree that does what an oak tree you imagine it does. It goes straight up in the air. But to the left there's this gnarly old thing which is It's a hornbeam that the trunk is sort of so rotted away, it's pretty much only, a third of its bark and edge wood is surviving.
It's amazing because it looks incredibly healthy.
But that's the thing, because this is an old pollard, and there's a few of them. You can see them around this clearing, and this is the typical Epping Forest managed landscape. So what they used to do was these hornbeam trees. Hornbeams, wood is incredibly tough, so it burned slowly. It's very good for things like smithing. It's also very good for machinery. So if you're building cogs for water mills or something like that, or it's a great wood for that. So it was an in-demand wood. Now this Epping Forest landscape 1,000 years ago, they think was 90% small leaf lime trees, and there's none of those trees in the forest now. Really, I know there might be a couple, but it's not many. Now the dominant species are hornbeam like this one, beech further north, oak, and that's purely because of human interaction. It looks like wild or nature or whatever, but it's not. This is a landscape that's entirely made by humans and entirely shaped by the presence of London, because people needed the hornbeam firewood, they needed the tough wood for industry and so on. So what they do to make the trees look these spectacular and strange ways is that every 13 or 15 years they'd be cut. So you get a tree that grows up nice and straight, you cut it above head height so the deer can't nibble the branches, and then you just leave it, and 13 years later you get this growth of branches, and you cut it again, you've got a load of firewood, and then the tree will grow again, and it actually prolongs the life of a tree. It's good for the tree, and they live far longer when pollarded usually, or coppice, which is when you do it nearer the ground, than if you let them grow up. So these are very old ones that have been continuously pollarded. You do get some where the trunk is about 7 foot high, and there's like 5 or 6 gigantic trunks coming out of them there, which because they've not been cut since the 19th century, and they just look spectacular, those trees. And they're like, and there'll be no trees anywhere in that level of that number which look like that. So it's this incredibly unique landscape. So you can really see here there's quite a few, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these hornbeam pollards, which probably, I don't know, might be due for another cut. But also all around us you can see tons and tons of holly, which kind of blocks the view. And what's interesting about that is holly has come in pretty much in the last 100 years. Previously people used to graze cattle around, and the cattle would keep all the undergrowth down, which meant a lot of light came in, and this would have been a grassland with wildflowers and so on. Holly, because the grazing stopped, holly comes in and it just quickly fills it, grows very fast. And nothing really grows when there's holly nothing grows underneath holly. It blocks out all the light. I think it's toxic. So that's completely changed the landscape. We'll go to a bit in a minute where we've got rid of a lot of the holly.
I mean, it feels we're in a very kind of private area right now. This is very private. We're kind of enclosed. There's holly all around. There's a few trees, but you really forget that there's this great open expanse just sort of 100 metres that way. Yeah,
exactly. And that's what's crazy about the forest is you're in one landscape, an ecosystem 1 minute, and then boom, it completely changes. And this area is very enclosed, and in fact, I'm co-curating with Kirstine McNish a year-long programme of arts events for Waltham Forest Borough of Culture, and we had a sound installation here in July, because it sort of works as a sort of natural enclosed theatre space. And
it does, definitely, and it kind of has that sense of a place in a festival, perhaps even.
Yeah, exactly.
It has that
and
feeling.
we did an ecological survey of 30 by 20 metre area of the woodland, counted all this. You've got grass, you've got hornbeam, you've got oaks and so on. And Dan Jones and James Bully, sort of artists, scientists, mapped all the species in the space. Each species was given a musical motif, violins, cellos, all sorts. And then there were speakers hidden all around this space in the forest, in the ground, really high up in the tree. And they used a stimulus of the weather conditions, and what you'd expect different species to be doing in those weather conditions to algorithmically play a constantly generating piece of music through the trees. And I think that was one of the things, particularly with this programme for Borough of Culture, we really wanted to get to grips with, was that, nature is often sort of hived off as being this sort of stuff white people like or whatever. I'm a white man, I'm a nature writer, there's a lot of me doing it. So another thing we did was commission with the Willow Herb Review writers of colour to respond to Epping Forest. We got some amazing work back, and we've got Matina Roberts, who's a American poet, saxophonist, electronic musician, filmmaker, and she's doing a piece connecting the forest to the writing of Ursula K. Le Guin.
Which you mentioned in the book as well.
Yeah, because she wrote so amazingly about forests and our interactions with them and fear and tree consciousness. There's a short story called Vaster Than Empires and More Slow, which was a huge influence on my book. So it's exploring woodland as a very complex place that does belong to everyone. I mean, the forest was saved as the People's Forest. That ought to include, that was in the Epping Forest Act, they say it's the People's Forest. It ought to include all demographics who live around it, really. So it's a question of, using things like sound installations to bring a lot of different people into a place they might not normally go to for whatever reason.
And that also reminds me of, there's a very enigmatic character in the book, which is the man who lives in the forest.
Yeah, he was a character, he was kind of incredible. I was able to find him, really. He lived in the Epping Forest up in Faden Boys, and my uncle and auntie would see him every day walking past their house. Big beard, striking looking man. Kids used to think he was Father Christmas at Christmas time. And he ended up in the woods. He'd been going to kill himself, couldn't do it, thought if he stopped taking medication he would be able to end his life, and he started walking, ended up in the forest, and it did kind of change his way of thinking, and he had a very deep connection to the place. It's not like any sort of nature sort of connection I've ever seen. It really done something for him. And the reason the book became more about me than the forest, or kind of my relationship with the forest, was because when I was writing it, I was just in a terrible mental state, and I think I was coming into the woods to, find that healing, and he was someone who'd found it, and I was trying to work out how I could get that. We're always told there's this very hip thing, forest bathing, which I keep reading articles about. There's lots of books about it. Japanese theory that you walk in the woods and the enzymes cleanse you, and it's amazing psychologically. And I found there was such an orthodoxy that nature is good for your mental health. Forest bathing will wash away your sorrows. And I found that really toxic, because if you come into the forest and that's not working, they're incredibly oppressive places. They're claustrophobic. You can't see out, you get lost very easily. There's all sorts of sounds and sights that just trigger, I think, a very ancient species memory that's ingrained in all our psychologies of fear. And I wanted to sort of question that nature equals good orthodoxy. I think it can do wonderful things, but it can also be quite difficult as well. And you can end up feeling worse because you haven't been cured by nature,
And I think there's a line where you write that you became sort of scared of taking your baggage into the forest, and I think we can just bring it in and leave it there.
Yeah, and you really can't.
That really wasn't your experience.
No, you just take it out, and sometimes you've collected more baggage. You've picked up more litter on the way. There goes some squirrels having a brutal fight.
Squirrels
over there. And that's another thing about changing landscapes. There weren't any squirrels in the forest 200 years ago, and when they appeared, they were trying to shoot them all. They were just trying to remove the forest population, squirrel population, obviously lost, because there are loads of them now, but they're incredibly damaging to trees, squirrels, because they gnaw away at all the bark, which is how the tree, under which the tree draws up its water and nutrients. Well, it's the interesting thing, there's often you hear this talk of rewilding, let's let nature do what it wants, but, what you'll find is all these places that have been rewilding, they spend a lot of time shooting deer because there's no top-level predator like wolves that once would have kept the deer populations down. And deer will just breed and breed and breed, and they're very destructive to forest. That's why the pollards are cut high, so deer can't reach the new growth. They will just eat everything. And so you have to keep deer numbers down, and because we haven't got wolves wandering around Chingford, you have to shoot the deer. So there's rewilding is this idea of you letting nature go back and do exactly what it wants. It's kind of not true unless you put in a top-level predator. That's what they did in Yellowstone Park. They reintroduced wolves, and they kept the deer and the elk down, and that totally restored an ecosystem. In the UK, because we can't really do wolves near London, you have to shoot the deer, and they sell it in a freezer at the visitor centre.
So it's actually quite a curated thing, rewilding, isn't it?
Well, I think it is. I think, and people miss that curated aspect of it. And then, speaking of curating the forest, this area here, I came here one Sunday morning. Now it's quite open. You know, there's grass growing. There's a path through the middle. There's a little thicket of hornbeam there with lots of honeysuckle in it, and there's a young oak tree next to us. Now this was totally densely packed with holly, kind of like we saw over there. It was a very overgrown area. This path was totally hemmed in by holly and hornbeam saplings, and I come up here with the Epping Forest Conservation Volunteers, and we cleared all of this, which has let light in, and now that's encouraging grasses to come up. Hopefully we'll get... there was a foxglove growing here in the spring. And it's one of those paradoxes, cutting down trees is bad. Is it always bad? We do get people when we're doing this conservation work, why are you cutting down trees? That's bad. And it's like, well, we're not just cutting down trees, we're improving this ecosystem in terms of the potential of increasing biodiversity. And then that is a subjective decision. That's one trying to restore a historical landscape. It's quite controversial and so on, but it shows that there's this real nuance to how humans operate within a landscape. And the creation of Epping Forest was humans working as part of nature for, cutting pollards and grazing animals here actually was very beneficial for the biodiversity of the forest. It was a really mutually virtuous relationship where the trees lived longer. There's all that dead wood you can see in the pollards that I was talking about earlier. That's incredible for insects and so on. Rotting wood is one of the finest habitats going, and that in turn is good for bird species. And you can see sort of how actually intervening to stop it becoming a totally choked, holly-filled landscape can be very good for a certain sort of biodiversity.
One thing that you write in the book is that Epping Forest is often referred to as Epping
Forest, yeah.
And this is referring to the cruising that happens. And I wondered when did Epping Forest or forest in general become a place that you realised had a kind of sexual component?
I think, I'm wondering when I would have first realised. I guess you sort of start when you become a teenager. You start, I grew up in the 90s before the internet. Wooded areas are where you found porn mags, and that was such a big deal when you were a teenager in the mid 90s. Was seeing naked people was just like wow, mind blowing. Yeah, which sounds really weird now when you can see naked.
So ubiquitous
people
now,
everywhere.
Yeah.
So there was always that element, and you'd find strange things in wooded areas. And I guess when I got older and sort of experiencing things like cruising and which is going to those sorts of places, you see forests as sexual, and they're sort of like there's something kind of quite intensely about the sort of sexuality that can happen in forest. It can be very intense. And even and then you just see it through the forest history. When we were doing the ecological survey up the way there, as well as doing an ecological survey, we did a sort of accidental human survey and found booze containers dating back to the Victorian type. The bay around this is 30 by 20 metres. It's not that big an area, and we found 15, 20 booze receptacles from cans of lager back to really nice Victorian bottles. We found hypodermic needles, and we found like 4 condom wrappers. That's a 30 by 20 metre bit of the forest. That's kind of amazing that there's that much sex gone on in that bit of the forest. So I really did find that fascinating.
And it speaks to what you were saying earlier about the derivation of the word forest being this place apart, or because clearly, this is a space which it doesn't have any morality. There is no oppression about what sexuality needs to be. It's a place of sexual exploration and kind of abandon.
Exactly. And I think you've got to look at the historical aspect to that, where all of our families, all our descendants would have been pretty much, vast majority would have been agricultural labourers who lived in very small cottages with most of their relatives, where they all went out into the nature to have sex. That's where the entire country, Shakespeare calls it country matters as a euphemism, in Hamlet, I think. That's where the nation was conceived. The whole British or global, everywhere, it was people having sex in wood. And we've just forgotten that. So now it's like nature writing or nature art just doesn't have any sex in it, which I find bizarre. Because it is historically a place where a lot of sex happened, and it still is. I mean, I helped location scout for a porn film, like kind of arty, it was made by a queer director, and we did a film in a forest, and it was very interesting that, I was on lookout duty, and there's 2 people shagging on a tree, and there's all people walking past, but nobody really noticed, even though there was all this going on, and you didn't really have to head people away. It's just it was people look forward, and you can see only a small amount in front of you. Just other bits of the eye just make up what's happening. So you can get away with things in forests that you just really can't anywhere else.
There's a line where you say the forest just is. It doesn't hold any. It can hold contradiction.
And
I think this is obviously a huge part of the book in talking about your sexuality as a bisexual, and how outside of the forest you're forced to choose one. Each community saying you're not one of us, or you're too this for that. But this was very much somewhere where you could allow that kind of contradiction not to be a contradiction. Yeah, exactly, because there's this. I mean, I say in the book, there's no morality to nature; it just is. What I like about woodland spaces or anywhere where you're kind of separated from people. It's kind of why I love cities as well, though. I mean, the reason I moved to London was the total anonymity, and you could do whatever you wanted and there was no one there to judge you, even though you're surrounded by people. Forests aren't that dissimilar. This is the bit where I see the binary dissolve. You are on your own within this space in a similar way as you are in a city. But it was a sense of kind of going to, these forests are more ancient than things like morality. There's no, and that's why I have trouble with this whole sentimentalisation of nature, is that is such a gigantic human imposition on it. It really it's not right that we sort of tweeify and prettyify nature. It is part of us in all that complexity. So we're just crossing a tiny little bridge here that is very twee, I think, and we're entering this space with a kind kind of dried up little
this is the thing you can see here, how the forest is trained. I mean, it looks beautiful. There's some lovely old hornbeam pollards. You can see these ones have got these bigger trunks. They look like sort of long-fingered hands coming up out of the ground, and the beech mast is falling, the leaves are starting to fall, so there's this lovely green on the ground, and the stream sort of winds its way through. The thing is, this stream usually ought to be, by this time of year, full of water, and because of climate change, the forest is getting very, very dry. It's been in severe drought conditions for 2 years now, and the water table is dropping away, and that's going to have a massive impact on the forest in the future, because we don't know how trees are going to respond. how they'll respond to extreme heat. Hello, dog. Walking past.
Morning.
So you can see these sort of, even in this beautiful little vista here, I used to look at it and say, well, that's climate change right there, and that dried up stream. Forests always used to be incredibly boggy, and it's it still is in the February or March, but it used to be boggy for a lot longer. It didn't dry out that much. But yeah, no. See, that's the thing. It is. I mean, you think about where we've come from. Just that very dense, low headroom almost, and then we've come out here and there's this little winding brook with trees leaning over it, very high sunlight coming through. It's fascinating how quickly the landscape changes. Now I need to.
We can hear right now. Because you're still getting a little bit of activity from somewhere, but it feels very far away.
I had a reversing car alarm. I mean, this is. I've got a friend who I collaborate with on live gigs. I do readings, and he plays music. And I met him in the forest, and he's a sound recordist. And he was saying, I struggle with doing my field recording in the forest because of the planes and the cars and the people. I was like, but that's the joy of Epping Forest, is the human presence.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud.